Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where I look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to do a movie review but to focus almost entirely on the film's 3D, with just a short word at the end about the film itself, and this time I'm looking at the 2004 film I, Robot, which had a 2012 re-release on 3D Blu-ray. So this is a legacy conversion, but unlike some of the other legacy conversions, of which there were only a tiny handful anyway, including the likes of Titanic and Jurassic Park, this conversion was done for the home market only, so it didn't get a cinema release. And more than that, also unlike Titanic and Jurassic Park, this wasn't done using the time-consuming and labour-intensive process that's given to 3D cinema releases, but instead it was carried out by a much more automated process. One thing it does have in common with Titanic's 3D re-release, though, is that the aspect ratio was reformatted from 2.39 to 1 to 1.78 to 1, although unlike Titanic, this wasn't achieved by simply opening up the matte to reveal more image at the top and bottom, but it also involved trimming bits of the image off the sides of the frame as well. It was Laserdisc and DVD that fought and won the war to preserve original aspect ratios on home releases, and I'm slightly disappointed that it's a format that I love, 3D, that surrendered some ground on that front. When Fox was deciding which films to put through this process, and I think only 2 or 3 others, including Jumper, ended up getting the treatment, I can't help feeling it was shots like this one that made them think that the film would be a good candidate for a 3D makeover. So row upon row of robots stretching deep into the frame. This is a shoo-in for a nice 3D shot, so it's something of a shame and a surprise that this looks nothing like as good as it should. It's not that there's no sense of depth, they do manage to achieve that, albeit extremely mildly, but there's absolutely no separation in between each of the robots. And what I find a bit curious about this shot is that it's a horizontal left-to-right tracking shot of static objects, and what that means is they could have easily created a few seconds of effectively genuine, high-quality native 3D here by making a second eye view just by shifting the left and right eye views by a few frames. I honestly don't think that would have taken them more than about 5 minutes to do, and if they'd done that, I suspect it would have been by far the best 3D shot in the film. Anyway, instead we get views in this sequence that are typical of this film's 3D. That's to say, in my opinion, they're barely fit for purpose, and this is not what 3D is supposed to look like. So faces are entirely flat, and there's a strong feeling of the cardboard cutout effect with them. I mean, there's no perceptible depth in any of the faces here. They have put a little bit of depth into Bridget Moynihan's hair, but none in her face. There is one occasion where it's fair to say that the cardboard cutout effect is intentional, or at least it accidentally pays off, when we see the great James Cromwell with a paper flat face, and then we get the reveal that he's actually a hologram, although quite weirdly it's a 2-dimensional hologram, if that's even a thing. There's never anything approaching strong depth, but some shots actually looked fully flat to me, like this one, completely 2-dimensional. Cityscapes are very dull from a 3D point of view, definitely no hint of hyperstereo. There's obviously the argument that this is the more realistic view of distant objects, and we wouldn't see this view in 3D in reality, except they put some weird depth effect in without including separation between the buildings, so it just looks cheap and, I think, worse than flat. There's a craft flying by in the left of the screen here, and in halfway decent 3D, you'd notice it because it would be in a clearly different 3D space to the backdrop, but not here. Probably a majority of the 3D films that I've looked at here have someone pointing a gun at the camera, and it's very rare for these to be devoid of some sort of 3D effect. Well, these gunshots are about as close to devoid of 3D as you'll get. Just a tiny hint of the gun emerging from the screen, but with no solidity and barely any depth to it. The same sort of thing with these needles, another obvious candidate for a piece of 3D pop-out, but with virtually none delivered, and the whole object feeling the same as a lot of things do in this film, like a 2-dimensional object in 3-dimensional space. Again, this is not the way 3D should look. A robot jumps out towards the camera a few times, in slow motion too, but there's a minimal amount of depth between the robot and the background, nothing like what you'd reasonably expect. Corridors nearly always look good in 3D films, but they do a great job here of making the corridors look like a flat backdrop with no stereoscopic depth to them at all. I'm not sure how much of a coincidence this is, but here's a piece of JVC kit in the film, and it was a JVC or JVC Kenwood process that was used to convert the film. It's worth mentioning at this point that there's a colossal and beautiful irony going on here. The film is basically about the perils of artificial intelligence, using robots to replace the work of humans. So, brilliantly, that point is made to perfection by the quality of the 3D that's been served up here. Whilst it is better than hitting the auto-convert 3D button on a TV, or a German auto-conversion, it's otherwise barely of any relevance. And anyone familiar with half-decent 3D will be dismayed at what this robotic process has created. It's a sort of judgment day for 3D, but thankfully this process was dropped almost as soon as it was picked up. In fairness, it's not all totally hopeless though. There are one or two moments that work adequately, like a sequence underwater has some bubbles in 3D space, although it does look a lot like just one flat layer of bubbles. There's one of those half in, half out of the water moments where the break of the surface gives the shot some feeling of 3D, and one or two of the top-down views actually look okay with a genuine feeling of depth. Not all that strong obviously, but some actual depth, which is nice, and I think the best of these involve some robots falling into that 3D space. I'd go as far as to say this shot is quite okay. And similarly, there are a few views looking up into structures where there's a reasonable amount of depth present too. And there are some bits of debris that fall or blast into 3D space, not in a great way, but not in a terrible way either. So there's some modest 3D effect going on here, although during this sequence they ramp up the shaky cam, which is always a major enemy of 3D. Other things that I'd have expected to look good include the car's heads-up display, but it hardly occupies any 3D space of its own, or this one's even worse, looking flat and with the lights of the tunnel sitting in exactly the same 3D space as the hologram. And that hologram has a load of 3D cues in its design seen in 2D, as you can see here, but it looks almost entirely flat, courtesy of this film's miserable 3D. You know how good 3D can separate out everyone in a crowd shot and give depth, space and solidity to the scene? Well, there's none of that going on here. And in what I'd nominate as the worst shot of the film, this moment's just an ugly mess with all sorts of mixed up and incorrect depth information. It's really quite horrible. There are also weird 3D cheats going on, like in attempting to put some depth into the road here, they put a strange kink into it, so it sort of looks like the road's been folded along a seam. It's the same in the tunnel here, where the depth change isn't linear but sudden, and this happens elsewhere, like where they're walking here. It's just strange looking and wrong. I tend to avoid using the term layering, even though I know a lot of 3D fans use it, as do people in the business who create 3D, but to me a layer always sounds like something that's flat, so it brings to my mind a cardboard theatre kids toy. In the case of iRobot though, I think it's a very appropriate word. So for example, this looks like layering, as in there are about 4 layers, Smith, the table, the wall and the bathroom. All layers, no solidity. The fan here spins as a separate layer, but there's otherwise nothing three-dimensional about the shot. Similarly, this top-down view, which ought to look good, just feels like a few layers with little depth or separation to them. And Smith's line during this shot is, "That's a long way down." Well, I'm glad you pointed that out, Will, as the 3D does virtually nothing to sell the notion of height. This makes me chuckle a bit, as the robot sort of looks a little like a depth map, one of those images you'll have seen if you've ever looked at how real post-converted 3D is created, or if you're as old as me and remember Magic Eye pictures, the image that they put at the back of the book, which not only let you know what the image was, hidden away amongst all the squiggles, in case you couldn't see it, and it was probably a shark, but also showed how the depth in the image varied, so that must be at least a 30-year-old technique that they use. Anyway, that's the only thing that I thought was interesting about the robot from a 3D point of view. And on the subject of the robots, they've got a sort of translucent outer covering, so you can make out bits of rods and pipes and whatnot beneath their surface. In good 3D, these could look great with some nice, subtle but effective 3D at work, like that view of the veins you see inside Doctor Strange, for example, but that would be far too advanced for what this film's conversion was capable of doing, so these don't offer any interesting 3D views either. In the right hands, I think 3D is an underappreciated and legitimately legitimate storytelling tool that can genuinely heighten a film's drama and our emotional response to it, or if it's not doing that, it can at least still be a fun and visceral enhancement to the look and feel of a film. But in the wrong hands, human or robotic, it can just be a tool for those who would make a cynical cash grab, utterly devoid of artistic merit, no fun to look at, and a mockery of genuine stereoscopy. And hands up who agrees that I, Robot is an example of the latter. Thanks, Willie. And there's his hand, shifted shamefully into unconvincing 3D space as a two-dimensional object against a flat backdrop. So just a very quick word about the film itself. I admit that I've never read any Isaac Asimov, but apparently neither had the filmmakers, as I believe this just takes his title and 3 laws of robotics, and then goes on its own merry way with them. It's maybe like they wanted to make something like a version of Blade Runner that would appeal to 10-year-olds, and with a load more action, and I don't mean that as a criticism necessarily, as that's the sort of thing that's quite up my street. And it's okay fun, maybe without really digging too deeply into the issues it raises. It's a bit lightweight, but I guess the moment that they cast Will Smith, that was always going to be the case. I do like the way his cop actually does some police work, investigating a death and discovering things along the way, so there is an unfolding story, even if it doesn't offer too much in the way of surprises. Alan Tudyk provides the voice of the robot, which might be the best performance in the film, although I think he went on to do the same job much more effectively in Rogue One. Overall, it's certainly not a classic, and it does feel all fairly familiar, but it's totally watchable, although hopefully you won't come away from it wanting to get FedEx to deliver you a pair of Converse boots to wear whilst driving your Audi, for all that the film's blatant product placement wants you to. And most of all, I hope you won't come away from it wanting JVC to auto-convert your video into 3D. As far as the 3D goes, I'd only really cautiously recommend this to the more committed 3D Blu-ray collectors, if you've already got perhaps 200 or 300 3D movies and you know in your heart that you've seen more than the best that the format has to offer, but just want a 3D fix anywhere you can find one, then maybe it's worth a look. Go in with expectations set extremely low, and there's a chance it won't annoy you as much as it annoyed me. If I watch it again, I'll stick with the 2D version on the basis that, whilst it's only offensively bad once or twice, the 3D is fairly hopeless almost all of the time, and of course the originally released 2D Blu-ray is in the correct aspect ratio. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.